Now, our guest host for tonight's event with Jamie Ford is Rich Fahle. Rich lives near Ann Arbor, and he drove up this morning commenting on how the colors in the north are already changing and looking much more beautiful and colorful than they are downstate, but also taking in stride the fact that he had a flat tire just 25 miles outside of town. Lucky for him, he had a little fix-a-flat in the car and then got it taken care of once he got to town. Rich is making a return visit to the National Writer Series, backed by popular demand. He served as a guest host for an evening in conversation with Nathaniel Philbrick in May. He is the founder and CEO of Astral Road Author Media and Bibliostar TV, which is entertainment for readers. He served as vice president of digital content, e-commerce, and entertainment at Borders, and was the chief spokesperson and communications director at C-SPAN. I also had the good fortune to work with Rich for many years at Borders, and I am very thrilled that all of you are going to get to know him a little bit better this evening. New York Times bestselling author Jamie Ford has been hanging around in northern Michigan for a few days now. Jamie spent 2 days in Petoskey, where he participated in Booktopia. He and his wife, Leisha, are traveling together, and they have both been raving about the beauty and culture and the overall wonderfulness of northern Michigan. They've actually had a couple of pies from GT Pie already. They drove in from Petoskey yesterday just in time for dinner, and on the way to dinner, Jamie politely asked me if I was a fan of Breaking Bad, which I really understood to mean that he wanted to be back to his room in time to watch Breaking Bad. So I told him that it was playing at the State Theater, and New York Times bestselling author Jamie Ford watched the finale of Breaking Bad at our very own State Theater. And then this morning I took Jamie and his wife came along to be on Omelet and Friends, and as the interview was a whole lot of fun, but it's what actually happened outside before we went into the studio that I thought I would share with you. Leisha looked down at the ground and exclaimed, "Are these acorns?" Now, evidently, acorns aren't something that you see all the time when you live in Montana, and Jamie told me that's the same holds true for pine cones. And Leisha and Jamie both kind of did this little acorn dance, which maybe one or both of them will repeat for you later this evening if you ask them nicely. But when that happened, I realized what I already suspected, that tonight's event is going to be another amazing National Writer Series event. So please join me in welcoming Rich Fahle and Jamie Ford to the City Opera House stage.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Welcome. Nice to see you here.
Thanks. Wow.
Well, welcome to Traverse City.
Yeah, thanks. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, it's apparently where the cool people watch Breaking Bad and where they go to watch the government shut down. Both things.
Yes. Fiction and reality, both kind of tragic.
Well, we're very glad to have you. The Songs of Willow Frost is another beautiful book. Hopefully many of you have had a chance to read it in the audience. I thought we'd start, though, on the fact that your 2 books, Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet and Songs of Willow Frost, both really look at Seattle in some very specific time periods, the 20s and 30s for Songs of Willow Frost, and the 40s primarily for the Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Maybe you can talk to us about that era, especially of Seattle.
Yeah, Seattle. It's interesting with Hotel. No one really asked about Seattle in particular because the next book could be about Boston or something like that. But when you do 2 in a row, it becomes a pattern. If you kill one person, it's a murder. If you kill 2, you're a serial killer. There's this. They're looking for the reason behind that, and I had to think about it, and Seattle really was, it was the place where I first had my heart broken. And so I have an emotional connection to Seattle. And I haven't lived there for a number of years, but I think writers write about what they lament, and I write about the Seattle that I knew, and really the Seattle that isn't there anymore.
How long did you live in Seattle?
About 2 months. No, I'm just kidding. Impactful 2 months. No. I've been visiting Seattle off and on when I was a little kid, living in Southern Oregon, because that was where my grandparents were, so my dad grew up, where my Chinese family is, and we moved there between 5th and 6th grade, and then I lived there through college and a few years afterwards.
Is it rude to ask that story of the first time your heart was broken? What happened exactly?
Rude to ask. No, it was, well, I had a crush not on one girl, but on two girls. I had a crush on a set of twins, which it's a very practical thing because it ups your average. No triplets available, just the twins. Heather and Holly Farrow. One of these days they'll be in the audience somewhere. Yeah, and the tragic thing is the two of them had a crush on my best friend Sean. And I'm thinking, there's two of you, there's one of him. One of you is gonna have to find him repulsive and me fascinating. But unfortunately, I mean, we're talking like fifth graders, so it's very, very innocent. But I felt that. And it was also the time when we moved to Seattle, which was, anyone that's moved, regardless of age, you leave friends behind, and that's heartrending. And then I moved to Seattle, where it was a city of perpetual rain. I mean, I don't mean to exaggerate, but in my mind, maybe we should check the meteorological records, what it said, but in my mind, it rained from like September to April. And I just didn't see the sun, and it kind of affected, well, when I was a kid, not as an adult even, it's the joke of my family that if I was in a heavy metal band, it would be called Melancholica. Because it affects you, and it creates that kind of emotion, which sometimes appears in my fiction.
It sounds like a 1970s sort of after-school special kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm partial to a show. I have the whole series on DVD called James at 15.
I know it.
Do you know the
I
show?
know, well, of course. Lance Kerwin.
Lance Kerwin, yes. Oh man, it was a
Wait, you were living the Lance Kerwin story, because I think that show, he's leaving and he's looking out the back window at his like broken love.
Oh, totally. That was my story, because it was this movie, James at 15, which became a series, critically acclaimed drama, which was knocked off the air by the Dukes of Hazzard or something like that. 70s were not a high point in our culture for drama, but it was set in Oregon. And my given name is James, so I had some sort of buy-in to this. And it was this story of this boy pining away for this impossible girl. And in the end, he gets the girl, but in a very 70s benign kind of way. And then the show ends on another beat when they pack up and move to Boston. And they move away, and he's standing on the street corner, and he's waving goodbye. I'm sorry, he's in the car waving goodbye to his sweetheart who's on the corner waving back, and they have the moving van packed up, and they pull away, and they drive off into the sunset. And there was a very sad, melancholic piano music, and the credits just started to roll. And that was the end. And I remember watching that as a little kid and just thinking, oh, love sucks. This is horrible. I was so vested in those characters. It really haunted me. And I was an emotive kid. I went to school the next day, and we lived in this valley. And it was probably like northern Michigan in the 70s, where you have one channel or two TV channels. So everyone saw the same movie. And everyone at school, they're calling me James at 15. They're like, hey, James at 15. But they thought the movie sucked. And I loved it.
Oh, I loved it too. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am that we got to talk about James at 15.
It's a great show.
Here, yeah.
It was awesome.
It was great. I thought I was alone.
Nope.
Yeah. A long lost brother.
Yeah.
So, in addition to that time, though, in Seattle and your sort of love of Seattle, there was this period of time, the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
Your own father and mother grew up in that area, if I understand correctly, and maybe you could explain sort of your attachment to the two periods of time that you really go after in these two books.
Oh, yeah. Hotel is set in the 40s. It's World War II. Also jumps to the 80s, but the meat of the story is in the 40s with the Japanese internment. My dad was Chinese. My dad spoke Cantonese fluently. And he went to Chinese school to learn city Cantonese, so he didn't have such a thick accent, even though he was born here. And he was given he was a teenager during World War II, so he was given one of those buttons that reads, "I am Chinese," because walking to public school, the kids would think he was Japanese, and they would throw rocks at him, and he'd get in fights and things like that. And that little moment became a short story, which later became Hotel. But oddly enough, as I was researching Hotel, actually I was researching a story which became Hotel. But what I initially set out to research was the story of my grandparents, who in the 20s, they met in a backroom gambling parlor called the Wah-Mee Club. And my grandfather was a blackjack dealer, and my grandmother was the coat check girl. And that club appears in Songs of Willow Frost.
Yeah, the Wah-Mee and the Fifth Avenue Theater and some other famous, and the Panama Hotel in your first book, and some really famous Seattle landmarks make their way into your book, as well as a lot of true life characters that you sort of weave into your fiction. But the Wah-Mee and the Fifth Avenue Theater, those are, I don't know if the Wah-Mee is still actually standing, but I know the Fifth Avenue Theater is still there. These are places, obviously, that you may have visited as a child as well?
Yeah, I had been in the Fifth Avenue, but I didn't really pay attention to it at the time. I was there for a concert or for a show or something like that. But to realize that some of these buildings, and it's a place like this that has such a history, that has its footprint in every decade, and there's multiple generations that have memories tied into a place, and it becomes a silent character in the neighborhood, in reality and in the book. And same with the Wah-Mee Club. It was the site of a mass murder, a mass shooting in the 80s, which really blighted the whole neighborhood. But before that, for 7 decades, all the way through Prohibition, it was a place in the community where a lot of people had good times. And before Vegas, if you wanted, booze or gambling or other kinds of illicit fun, you tended to go to places like Chinatown.
And the Fifth Avenue Theater is this beautiful theater. I mean, how fun was it to go back into its prime and to write a story where it's not just thought of as a famous old theater, but it's actually in its moment in history?
Yeah, I mean, just to think of a time when there were so many working musicians playing live music. So you'd have a silent film with a live, 8, 10, 12-piece orchestra performing, and these musicians going from venue to venue, or having a huge pipe organ installed. In its heyday, when everything has a vintage look to it now, but to walk in where you could still smell the paint, there's something magical about that.
And clearly your appreciation of classic film comes through, especially in Songs of Willow Frost, where you reference Jackie Cooper and Myrna Loy, and you write about all these classic actors and actresses of the time. And this was at a time,
I was born in the wrong era.
I mean, it's the idea of the silver screen, but you also had other characters that, like Sept and Fetchit and Anna May Wong, who you can maybe talk about, these two characters that were famous, incredibly famous, but were sort of on the wrong side of fame, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, they're the characters that definitely come to mind. It's Anna May Wong, Sept and Fetchit, and the other one is Sesue Hayakawa, who was famous Japanese silent film actor whose career basically was killed by World War II. And ironically, he would come back and win Best Supporting Oscar for A Bridge Over the River Kwai. So his career went into a coma for 3 decades. But especially Anna May, Lincoln Perry, who was known as Sept and Fetchit, they were so popular, immensely popular at that time, but there were certain things they couldn't do, places they couldn't go. Anna May could never have an on-screen kiss.
And she was a Chinese actress.
She was a Chinese actress. Right. She died in all her roles until she left the States and went to Europe and appeared in some different movies. So she was always the dragon lady, and same with Sept and Fetchit. These are characters that they were so successful, they were beloved in their time, but they were a caricature of something that we now find somewhat offensive. And history's not been kind to them. Characters like Anna May, in her later years, she went to China. She was born in the United States, went to China thinking she'd be accepted, and they hated her. Felt like she was too American to be accepted. And she she was too American to have a Chinese suitor, but she was too Chinese to have a Caucasian husband because of the laws in California. So she had these romances with these Caucasian producers and directors, but she could never find true love. She never married, and she really kind of died of a broken heart.
Well, you write about that in song. And Willow Frost, the main character, also her real name Lu Song.
Yeah.
They talked about her fans at one point, and her fans were men, usually Caucasian men, but she had no Chinese fans, even though she was a Chinese actress. So these people perennially lived in between their two cultures.
They did.
Not accepted by either in many cases.
Right, and that's you know, Willow Frost, Lu Song, who becomes Willow Frost. I mean, she's not biographical of Anna May. I mean, I think Willow Frost's story is even more tragic. But she does emote that of a time where we're such a confluence of cultures and economic status and stereotypes, and people could fit in, but only on the margins. And so she does. She has a measure of success, but that success costs her dearly.
The other thing I loved about Willow Frost is how you bounce between perspectives. Your other sort of character that you tell the story of is William Eng, who is the young boy who's at Sacred Heart Orphanage. I don't know if that's a real orphanage. Maybe
it is.
Yeah. So these are all things, obviously, you were able to research. But your other narrator, so to speak, is a young boy, and you follow his story. And you sort of slowly reveal elements of the story through your two narrators, Willow Frost or Lu Song and William Eng. To bounce between those and to write as a young boy and then as a woman, can you talk about the challenges of those shifting perspectives?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, William is an orphan, and he's living in Seattle's Sacred Heart Orphanage. It's still there, not as an orphanage. It's called the Villa Academy. It's a private school, but at the time, it was where a lot of kids that their parents during the Depression couldn't afford to care for them, so they ended up basically consigning them to the orphanage. Wallace Stegner and his brother were two of those orphans that ended up at Sacred Heart for a period of time. William's story was a little bit easier because, you know, I was a juvenile boy and sometimes a juvenile adult, and you know, I could feel that. I can identify with that kind of abandonment, and you know, I think everyone has moments in their life that they can relate, and then you magnify that for the story. Willow was different because I was a little nervous because, you know, my given name is Jamie, but I am a dude, I'm a guy, and you know, it's interesting, you don't see a lot of female authors producing, writing, you know, commando stories. I think it's interesting because directorially you have Catherine Bigelow, who did
Hurt Locker and
yeah, the Hurt Locker and the Zero Dark 30. So,
right.
so you know, there's no limitations, but sometimes we get put in boxes. And I went there hoping I could do it well. And I have had several people in interviews ask the inevitable question, to quote, you know, the movie As Good as It Gets, how do you write women so well? Which was, I don't know if you saw the movie, but Jack Nicklaus's answer is, I start with a man, I remove common sense and accountability or something like that. But it was a challenge to try to get into that mindset. But it was also a wonderful opportunity because I have a lot of respect and admiration for my mom, my grandmother, both my grandmothers really, who were alpha females at a time when they paid a certain societal price for being who they were. And so I could explore these things almost as an homage, but also to gain a better appreciation of who they were.
Did you grow up understanding their story, and were you a sort of storyteller from your younger days? Did you always get a sense for, you know, sort of an observer's role?
I knew bits and pieces, and probably why I write about Seattle so much is I didn't ask enough questions. And once your family starts to pass away, then those doors are closed forever, and you regret the things you didn't ask. And so the books are kind of an exploration of that. don't know if I was always a storyteller, but I was always in the arts. My degree is in art and design. My parents encouraged me to go into the arts, which I look back on that, and it was such a brave, noble thing to do, because I have a son who's going to major in music, and there is a part of me that's just like, oh man, be an accountant, you know? Be an accountant, be a lawyer.
Anything but.
Yeah, but you know, someone has to create art, so why not him? Why not me? And so, and to some of the young writers that were there today, why not you? And so, my parents encouraged all of the arts. I grew up in a theater town, and they never saw that as something you shouldn't do.
You know, one of the things as I was reading Willow Frost that I love, there's a scene in the book where, without going into too much detail, where William is leaving Sacred Heart for a short period of time and escaping just for a short period of time. And he escapes in a bookmobile, of all places. So like books as like literal escape, you know, like, and I think that to me, as I read that, as someone who loves books and grew up loving books and sort of understood that, it just seemed apropos that he would be running away in the back of a bookmobile, covered in books, and you know, running away.
And it was, I mean, it was true. One of the first bookmobiles in the country was in Seattle, 1931, the King County Library System. And they did it because there were so many kids in reformatories and orphanages. So the kids at Sacred Heart, they'd only be able to leave the orphanage once per year on an outing. And so they never left the grounds. And so the bookmobile would come around once a week. And it just seemed too perfect not to use.
Oh, it's great. It was wonderful. Did you grow up as a big reader? I mean, were you always reading books when you were a kid, or what kind of books did you like to read?
Oh, yeah, I was it's just terrible. My mom loved mysteries, and she was always forcing Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew on me. I hated those books. To this day, it's just it's like PTSDs thinking about the Hardy Boys. But I read, you know, I was your classic kid that read The Great Brain and Encyclopedia Brown and John Christopher's Tripod series, Tolkien, science fiction, fantasy. I had my phases. There'd be the science fiction phase, the horror phase, the Judy Blume phase. I told you I was a sensitive kid. I read all those books. And I read tons of comic books too, graphic novels. I mean, I still have a huge comic collection. So I tried to have, probably through my parents' example, just had unprejudiced reading taste. So whatever was around, I was curious, so I pick it up.
Yeah, another kinship moment with Encyclopedia Brown, where you're turning the book upside down to see like what Bugs Meany was doing and who the bad guy. Comic books, there's a lot of, you know, kids today, like it's funny because I foist a lot of books on my kids. I have a bunch of kids. We want to talk about yours too, but they gravitate towards graphic novels, which are having a real moment, obviously, for the past 10 or so years, and they're really growing. Comic books have always been popular, whether it's Archie or whatever.
Yeah.
But what was it about comics that you were always attracted to?
Comics, well, twofold. One, I was one of those kids that always had a sketchbook, and so my parents, you know, they saw that I had this thing for art, and they always encouraged it, so they were always buying me markers and inks and stuff like that. So I liked the art, but eventually I started to like the storytelling. And I'm living in, you know, a little neighborhood in Seattle, and through the comics I could be in Japan, or I could be visually in New York City or Los Angeles, and it not just or some fantastical world. So it was just comics were my gateway drug to fiction. It's a great gateway drug, and I'm still using that drug of comics. So
how are you? What kind of comics are you reading today, and like how are you sort of satisfying that urge to play around with that now?
Oh, there's a bit of a renaissance in graphic novels. You know, it's interesting. In Japan, there is a graphic form of storytelling for any audience. Right? You're 80 years old and you want women's fiction. There's a graphic novel for that market. It's not just, we see those type of books aimed at teenagers in the US, but in Japan, it's really everywhere. And I see a little bit of that happening here. So there's a great graphic novel called Blankets. It's a 600-page graphic novel by a gentleman named Craig Thompson. And it's a memoir of, and you don't think of graphic novel memoirs, but it's a memoir of growing up in Wisconsin, a fundamentalist Christian family, and he's this Holden Caulfield type character that's very vulnerable and open to all these different things, including a very oppressive family who sends him to a religious camp where they think it's going to be, paradise on earth, all these young religious teens, where they're all they're just teenagers, and they're all rebellious, and they're smoking and stuff like that. And he meets his match, this girl that basically is the female version of him. But she comes from a wildly different family, and it's this story of first love, and it's him going from adolescent to young adulthood, and it's heartbreaking. And you wouldn't imagine a graphic novel just like practically moving you to tears, but the art is just lyrical, and there's other things like building stories. Is this graphic novel thing in a box?
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it's a sandbox basically. It was in the New York Times Books Review, and then it sold out because they didn't anticipate the demand. But you open up this box, and it's got little pamphlets, and it's got newspapers, and it's got these pieces, and there's story on everything, and it's all loosely connected, but you can enter the story anywhere and be part of this world. And so there's lots of exciting things going on in that. When I meet with book groups and they ask me, what should we read? I always say, maybe once a year, add a graphic novel or add a book of poetry. Maybe in those summer months where you have a hard time getting together and people don't have as much time perhaps because they're going places, and it's a great way to kind of bridge those times.
Oh, I totally agree, and I think you're seeing more and more graphic novels for grown-ups now, like Alison Bechdel and all these other people that have sort of broken down those walls, and it isn't just something that kids buy with things.
And so many of them become movies, which is amazing.
And you have a visual background. You were an art director, and so I keep waiting for your graphic adaptation of Songs or of Hotel or a new book that you work on with somebody else even that sort of takes into consideration all those elements of your background.
I'd love to. I'm still trying to figure out fiction and novels and things like that. I've had some people wanting to turn Hotel into a graphic novel, which I was fine with, but there were just some bugaboo with my publisher, and they had the rights, and perhaps one day, I would love to. I think the visual medium is really interesting. It's this third space. It's not a book, it's not a movie, but it has the best of both of those types of storytelling all in one place. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm going to go back to William a little bit because the idea of the orphanage in Seattle and William waiting, historically the stories of these orphanages are also incredibly melancholic when you think about them. These parents who couldn't handle their children for whatever reason and they weren't ready, or that for whatever reason they would be dropped off. The kids had this expectation that their parents were going to come back someday and get them. And that was also the expectation of Sacred Heart. At some point, they sort of hoped that the parents would come back, but they often didn't. That idea of just perpetually waiting is one of the sort of weights that sort of goes all the way through this story, and I'm sure it's one of the things as a melancholy kid that attracted you to it. But what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, as a writer, I think of what if, and I wanted to dance around this orphan story or this orphanage, and it just seemed, if you're an orphan, if you've lost your parents, that's tragic in its own right, without a doubt. But if you're an orphan because your parents have left you there and you don't know if or when they're ever coming back, it's even more tragic because you don't ever have closure. You can't be adopted by another family, and you're just stuck for the duration. It's interesting because, and sad, but I did an event in Montana last week, and a woman drove 127 miles to come to the book event, and she comes up to me and says, hi, my name's Margaret, and I grew up in Sacred Heart Orphanage in Seattle in the late 30s. And she was born in Montana, single mother, had 3 children. Her mother, her and her 2 siblings, they moved to Seattle to find work, and then in the teeth of the Depression in the 30s, her mother couldn't support them and turned them over to Sacred Heart. And her story was even more tragic than the events portrayed in the book. And her mother returned one time to bring them coats in the wintertime, and then she never saw her mother again. I mean, it's just, you just feel that, and she was such a wonderful woman, and it's one of those moments that when you find these things as a researcher and a storyteller, you hope that the spirit of what you're doing comes through, and I was so honored that she came down to commune over that moment.
Yeah, that is amazing. And with your character William, he never believed he'd be adopted because he was Chinese, and he didn't believe that there was a family that would ever want him. When you think about the sort of difficulty of being sort of American-born Chinese at that time, sort of fitting in, and yet born there, feeling entitled to be in the United States, and yet not feeling like you belong, that sort of middle ground. Do you think that there's still evidence of that today, or how do you think that we've come along as a country where mixed race is becoming sort of part of the equation?
There's really two parts to that. As far as societal acceptance, I think we're slowly. I mean, we've come a long way, and then we have these. For every 2 or 3 steps forward, we step back and we see it, like the recent Miss America.
Right.
Where people, the Twitter feed exploded with people saying, why we're having an Indian Miss America. This is America. It was, and they were like, why we have a Taliban princess. I mean, it's just like this rampant, crazy ignorance.
As Twitter is wont to do.
As Twitter, yeah. It's 140 characters, the perfect space for small minds. Just to let it out there. So. Except Rich and I, because we're on Twitter too.
Yeah, we're very bright. We're smart.
But part of that change that will never change comes from within families. And I visited with a lot of ESL classes, English as a second language, in their reading hotel. And when I was first invited to visit with one of these classes, I thought they'd all be Asian kids. It was in Seattle. I just envisioned Chinese, Japanese kids. I walk in and it was everything but. It was kids from Bahrain, it was kids from Ethiopia and Kenya and Pakistan, and they all had this same conundrum of being born here to parents that for whatever reason, haven't really assimilated, and so their parents want them to have every opportunity as an American, but then want them to retain their heritage, want them to marry someone within their culture, marry their cousin. They want them to retain the language. And it creates a maddening thing for a child. And I think that event happening has happened for the last 200 years, of people that, it's Benjamin Franklin and his son. Benjamin Franklin's son was loyal to the King of England. You have the families fall on divisive lines of how much you should accept and embrace and move forward.
This is a fascinating topic to me because obviously as we go further and further along with generations, and as America becomes that melting pot idea becomes more and more part of who we are as a country, and as the country begins to accept that and sort of becomes natural and normal, what becomes of those sort of old cultural elements of someone's background and history, and is it important to maintain those and as it gets more and more sort of blended, into this new face of America?
Yeah, I think it's, there's when people own it themselves, I think it's wonderful. If you have, if you celebrate cultural identity within your family, that's great. It's when other people sort of use that to say, oh, that's a point of exclusion because you wouldn't understand, or you're not American enough, or, I've been here for 4 generations, you've been here for 2, so we win. Becomes this sizing up of what is American, and because I'm 4th generation, so my great grandfather came over in 1861, so we've been here for a while. And it's like, when are you completely assimilated, and when is it okay to showcase that identity? And it depends on which various group has been marginalized the most by history. I mean, sometimes I think some people for whatever reason, their culture breezes in, I shouldn't say breezes in, but has an easier go of it just based on social circumstance. And then you have people that are like, well, and I saw this in Hawaii, where I lived for a while. It was interesting because it was whoever came over as an immigrant worker first. So it was like, the Chinese got there, and then, we're talking in the 1800s, and then the Japanese workers come over and they don't like the Japanese, and then the Koreans come over and the Koreans don't, the Japanese don't like the Koreans, and then the Filipinos come over and the Koreans don't like the Filipinos, and then, it's
like the Sneetches.
Yeah, it's this, there's this like perpetual thing going on. And so eventually people are known by the merits of who they are, what they do, and they should be comfortable celebrating things.
And you're fourth generation, 1860s, but you're also a Ford, as in Henry and John, and like these American kind of feelings that go along with
red-blooded
those.
American, last of the Chinese Fords.
Chinese
that was my great-grandfather. His name was Min Chung. He came over when he was 13 years old, came over by himself with a bunch of other people to work. Worked briefly in the silver mining industry and later worked for the borax mining company in Nevada. And then around 1890, he changed his name to William Ford, which is, it's like someone coming over from Pakistan and changing their name to Chuck Norris, And we're not sure exactly why he did that, but we suppose it had to do with buying property, that he owned property, and we suspect that was the only way he could own it, was that he sort of had an American name on the documents.
And now you're in Montana.
Now we're in Montana,
You're the Montana Fords.
That's right, that's right.
So what was it about Montana that attracted you? Because that's obviously Seattle has this, sort of wet but wonderful history, and then you find yourself in the great American West now.
Yeah, Seattle's rainy. I lived in Hawaii, and I moved to Montana, and I live in a part of Montana where we have 300 days of sunshine, even when it's, sub-zero. And so it's so sunny, but I'm still kind of this melancholic person, and so my wife has decided it's always raining in my mind. Just doesn't matter where I am. But Montana, I used to, my standard, like when people ask me, because it was always like, why'd you move to Montana from Hawaii? Was that it was the witness protection program. And I joked with my neighbor, who was a retired U.S. Marshal, and he said, oh, they're all over this place. So
I'm sure they are. Actually.
There are, yeah, I believe it. The High Line of Montana, there's the Gambino family up there.
And you have this massive brood. You have you always call them a Brady Bunch family whenever you mention it, but it's true. You've got 6 kids.
Just the 6, yeah. Yes, there's just the 8 of us. Yeah. And part of it was, we have a big family. Part of it, it's a nice place to raise a family. It's like Traverse City. The quality of life is, off the charts. I'm kind of I grew up in Seattle, but I grew up outside of Seattle. It's like you say Chicago when you live in Naperville or one of the neighborhoods, and so I like the smaller environment. But as far as the kids, we do have a blended family. We have 4 daughters, 2 sons, and that's one of them calling right now. I'm busy. Have your sister take you to the mall. But they're all teenagers. So one turns 20 next week, and the other 5 are at home. So we have 2 seniors, a junior, a sophomore, and a freshman in high school.
Yeah. That's a great reaction right there. I could bottle that. I'm sure you get it all the time.
Yeah.
But it does sound like chaos. But on the other hand, when they get older, they start to take care of themselves and feed themselves and do things.
Yeah. Like the older sibling can bail the other one out of jail. It's awesome. Just go pick them up. No, they're really interesting human beings. You see them grow up and they're so different. And I would probably be just this beaten down shrivel of a parent if it wasn't for my 20-year-old who is so interesting and thinks I'm really cool. And so I look at, my grandmother used to say about like teenagers, like, well, they just haven't made it over Fool's Hill yet. And so we have a couple that are on their way up and they keep falling down. But I see through my 20-year-old that they do make it, and they become these really cool kids, and they come home from college, and they're so happy to see you, and it's fun. So I'm very hopeful about this.
How do you think your own decision to sort of dedicate yourself to art, you know, whether it was in your other job and then actually letting go of that as an art director and going all in on the writer thing, how do you think that's affected how your kids perceive their own future and what's possible for them? Because there's risk, obviously, involved in becoming an artist and counting on your words and your writing talent.
Yeah, you know, someone's got to do it. You know, but I have a son. He's going to major in music. He's a senior this year, and so we're applying to some different colleges. I have a daughter. She's 16. She's going to major in art. If they weren't as good as they are at the age they are, I would probably be gently, you know, an application for a different college would magically appear under their pillow or something like that. But if they're willing to put in the time, if they're willing to, you know, and it is a sacrifice of time, then I think good things will happen, or at least, you know, part of it is opportunity and timing and luck, but half of it is just being there and being there when that moment happens. And Taylor does music. If he wasn't a kid that just slept with his musical instruments practically every night, I would not be as encouraging. But even when they were younger, I kind of, you know, if I can do it, you know, so, I mean, again, Mick Jagger's gonna die eventually, you know. I did. I pulled my son aside and I said, okay, there is no backup plan for you. You're not going to major in, you know, law and be a musician. If you want to be a musician, be a musician. And this is what you're going to do. And I've got your back. And, you know, some fathers want their sons to be doctors and lawyers, and I want you to save rock and roll. Go. So that's his mission.
Well, you have and now you will. You obviously dedicated yourself to writing at some point. You decided, I'm going to do this, and you talked to me earlier about a class you took with Orson Scott Card. It's a boot camp.
Yeah.
And writing and boot camp don't always go together, but this one sounds like it really was. Maybe you could talk about how your own training came about.
Yeah, Orson Scott Card. This was 2000.
Who we should probably explain is that in case people don't know Orson Scott Card.
Sorry, Orson Scott Card, a science fiction and fantasy author, has written, I don't know, 30, 40 books, won every award in that genre, New York Times bestselling author. He lives in North Carolina, but the workshop was in Virginia on the campus of a small college. And you had to submit a writing sample to get in. And he selects 15 people, and you go and spend 8 days with him on this campus, and you live in the dorms, and there's no phone, there's no television. Basically, when I got in, I called and said, you know, what's there to, you know, I asked the lady who answers the phone, what's there to do, sightseeing, when I have downtime? And the lady laughed at me. She said, you're not gonna have any downtime. I thought, okay, and I went, and we didn't. We were in the classroom from about 8 o'clock in the morning to at least 5 or 6. One time we were in the classroom till 11 o'clock at night with breaks. And then we would write in the evenings, usually till 3 in the morning. And then we'd get a couple hours sleep and get up and read what we're supposed to read to critique at breakfast before we went to class. And we did that every single day.
Wow.
And it wasn't a, you know, most writing workshops, you bring something that you've already written, and you wordsmithed it, you poured over it, you submit it for review, and then you spend the rest of the week, you know, with a glass of Merlot in your hands, and you talk about books, and it's quite pleasant. And this one, you actually work, and he wanted to see how people worked so he could critique them in midstream and help you in different ways. And for me, it was, I wrote a short story there that became Hotel.
What did you take out of that class? What was your
takeaway?
The big takeaway from his?
The big takeaway was, well, two things. I was writing short fiction, and he basically said, if you want to be a full-time writer and make a living, you have to write novels. I mean, it's not, there's collections that do really well, but for the most part, it's the market for short fiction is almost theoretical. You know, it almost doesn't exist anymore. That was one thing. another thing, we were at dinner, and I'm kind of hemming and hawing about the stories I want to write, these kind of emotive family stories, and he was just like, shut up, you're just a whiner, write what you want to write. Yeah. And who cares who reads it? If you enjoy the process of writing, write it. And then at least you'll go to bed feeling satisfied. You don't think about sales or where the book's going to be shelved in the bookstore. Just write what's in you. And he really beat me over the head with this concept of, don't fall in love with your prose. Be a storyteller first. And so I went as a writer, I left as a storyteller. It's like a major league pitcher going as a thrower and leaving as a pitcher. There's a difference. And in addition to leaving with a short story that later became Hotel, in any number of ways, it was very transformative. And he liked the short story. He said, this will never be a novel.
Really?
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
You knew.
So I sent him a copy later.
Very nice, yeah. Touche.
Yeah.
Though as you read both your books, there's a short story component to them almost. I mean, your chapters are short, and the book sort of propels you through in a way not unlike science fiction or a thriller or something. And yet, it's literary fiction, but with that sort of technique where you're moving very quickly through the story, and it has to be crafted really well to do that. When you don't take a lot of pages to sort of get you from one point to another, we're moving quickly, in other words.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily by design to lure the reader in. It's more how much I can hold in my brain at one time. It was a short attention span almost. I mean, it's not James Patterson where one sentence is a chapter.
No, not at all. I certainly wasn't insinuating that.
No, but my chapters do tend to be scenes or part of scenes, and they tend to be what I'm ruminating at the time, and that might be 20 pages, or might be 3 pages, but that's how I see the story, is through these little moments.
Yeah. It's almost like a movie almost. Yeah. And your characters, there's always more to them than you let us know as we're reading it. And in fact, you start to get attached, or you don't like a certain person, and we learn that there's layers to people. And as I was reading the book, you wouldn't know where this was, but I actually have my bottom ones are the ones I want. You write something that I just wanted to read because to me, I felt like I was stumbling upon the theme of this book. But it says, if anything, meeting Charlotte's father had clarified a painful reality that even monsters can miss their children, because the uncomfortable truth is that no one is all bad or all good, not mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, or husbands and wives. Life would be much easier if that were the case. Instead, everyone was a confusing mixture of love and hate, joy and sorrow, longing and forgetting, misguided truth and painful deception. And as I read that, I thought, oh, shoot, he's right. I can't be mad at that person, or that maybe there is, maybe the Republicans are right about the shutdown. I don't know. I had to really think twice about a lot of things that I hold dear. I wanted to get your take on that sentence as well.
That's why it's interesting. This is a conversation we had recently with my daughter about a boy that she was dating. And it wasn't that he was all good or all bad. The problem was he was a little of both. And it's really easy if everything was black and white, but it's not. We stay in relationships, or we stay in jobs, or we stay in schools based on this sort of tipping scale. And it's never enough for it to be an easy, obvious decision. We have people who can be the most charming, wonderful, giving human beings that fly into a rage and will smack you around. Or you can have a boss that praises you, and then you catch him on the wrong moment and he'll bite your head off. And unfortunately, that's the human condition. And with relationships or jobs or any kind of relationship, it's so gray and so muddled. I mean, Hitler, who's awful, was so nice to his dogs. It's terrible. You want to just think that everything's bad, but that's what's so confounding about humanity. You tend to have this love-hate relationship with a lot of people in our lives.
Yeah, well, I think that you really explore that really well in this book, and it was, to me, one of the most important parts about it. I still, as I read it, though, I felt like I I missed a really wonderful era of film. The other day, as I was watching All About Eve, it came on, and I was watching this wonderful movie from, I think it was 1950, Bette Davis, a great movie. And yet I started to think, like, All About Eve, I bet you Jamie would love All About Eve. What were your, I mean, there's so much love for the cinema in this movie, and clearly you grew up as a television person and as a pop culture fan. What are your favorite films from that era and from that time, and favorite actors and actresses?
Oh, from that time.
It doesn't have to be from the 20s and 30s, but
Yeah.
really your favorite classic films.
Some of my favorite classic films, On the Waterfront, which with Marlon Brando. I think that's, I love Casablanca. Everyone else loves Casablanca. That's like, who loves chocolate? You know, there's gonna be that one person, that's Casablanca's terrible. I loved Lost Horizon with Ronald Colman, who was one of those actors who went from silent films to speaking roles. What's the? I'm forgetting it now. The. I can't remember the name of it.
Too much pressure.
Yeah, too much pressure. But I mean, there's also Kubrick's first film, the black and white one with Kirk Douglas. I can't remember the name of it, but it's about soldiers, French soldiers that basically they need to met out some sort of punishment to this unit.
Somebody in the audience knows the name
Yeah,
of this
I know.
film, and it's not. They have to yell it out.
What's that? Yes, Paths of Glory.
There we go. There we
go. Yes.
So we have this huge resource right
Yes.
in front of us.
Woohoo! Yeah. I mean, it's a magnetic film, and it has Kirk Douglas and these soldiers. They've screwed up, and they have to punish the regiment, and so they have to draw some to be executed at dawn at random to basically. And it's this sort of like dichotomy of the ruling command and their logic versus the men, the average soldier. Great film.
So we know you have one book on Seattle, another book on Seattle. What about your next books? And will we be calling them the Seattle Trilogy or Quadrilogy, or what will happen? And then will you start to write about another city? I mean, what are your thoughts?
The next one is
The Montana Fords.
Well, it has zombies. That's what it is. And it's set in Petoskey. It's a little different. No. The new book is another Seattle book. I have to. There's another one in me, and there may be more, but at least I knew there was at least 3. And this one jumps a little earlier in time, and it begins in 1909, around 1909, and between that time period and 1959, which it's bookended by the 2 World's Fairs in Seattle. The first World's Fair was called the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, and they had themed days. And so one day would be Agricultural Day, and they would give away, by a raffle, they'd give away a bushel of wheat, and another day they'd raffle off a cow, and one day they raffled off a child. And true story, and the child was donated by the Washington Receiving Home, and no one knows whatever happened to this child. And so I've wondered about this story, and I was always fascinated with that first World's Fair, because it's on the grounds of what is now the University of Washington, where I spent a lot of time. And, there's a slim visual record of it, which, I mean, it's amazing to see those photos, but curious about that. So I've had an opportunity to tell that story.
Do all of your story ideas come out of just researching in the past, and you find these little nuggets like that? Because something like that obviously had to have been in a book somewhere, or there's a little piece. I mean, something just sort of pops out at you, and it presents itself as a story.
Yeah, I mean, a couple different things. I mean, what first got me interested in that time period was the booming red light district in Seattle. Yeah. Seattle had a garment district where they had, I think, 600 seamstresses employed, but only 2 sewing machines. So they took turns or something. I'm not sure how that worked.
That's tricky.
Yeah. All night they worked. And so I was interested in that time period, and sometimes you'll be researching one thing and another thing will kind of manifest on the stage, and you'll realize that these characters know each other, and it becomes a greater narrative at that point. I do like connecting it to real history. I think, I mean, it's interesting. I was in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and in Chinatown, they're building a new trolley line. I mean, all through the city, but the segment that's going through Chinatown is under construction right now. And they have literally stripped back the pavement, and beneath the pavement are bricks. So the streets were once all brick, and then they stripped up the brick, and beneath it was a trolley line. So we paved over the trolley line, and then now we're putting a new trolley line. And we kind of just pour asphalt on history sometimes, and I like digging around and turning over rocks and looking at the squishy things underneath, and usually there's something really interesting there.
So every author is different when it comes to writing history and fiction, because some people are, I just talked to an author, Hannah Kent, who wrote a new book called Burial Right that's out right now, and she said where she knew the history, she was bound to that truth, that she couldn't vary from that at all. Where she could determine what actually had happened, she would not allow herself any sort of fictional flexibility. Anything else where she was sort of filling in the lines, she would sort of have free reign, but it was usually guided by her research. What about you, where you're bringing in real characters who are mixing with fictional characters in real places that are no longer here in some cases? What are your rules for writing history?
Yeah, it's tastes, they do vary, because some people will play wildly with history. I try to stick to the facts, and it feels, I will play around with little details as long as they don't affect the thrust of the actual history. I'm comfortable with that. There's certain things, like some things you just let go, and my copy editor catches these. It's amazing. So I'll have a character in 1942 get on the number 47 bus, and I just make up a number, and she comes back and has researched it. Oh no, it was the number 19 bus, and no one's really gonna know. And so little things I just let go, and I think I'm just really focused on the spirit of the piece, and especially with Hotel in the Corner, Bitter and Sweet, because there are still people who personally are alive, their families were affected by the internment, and so I had a reverence for that, and I didn't want to play with times, places, dates, but I also didn't want to be like Oliver Stone, where I'm gonna just fictionalize it with kind of a, I'm gonna jab this point that I'm trying to make in a little further. With Songs of Willow Frost, I try to be true to the locations, to the film industry, to the characters that existed, to the social dynamics that existed, and then just tell the story. I'm comfortable with that. And I know some authors, they would just drop in every historical figure that existed at that time, and as long as the reader knows what's going on, that you're having fun with history, I think it's great. But when they get regarded as an expert on, this event that is fictitious, then it gets a little nutty.
Well, I think the best thing about fiction with a historical angle or element, or historical fiction, which is a genre some authors don't necessarily like to use, but one of the things I love about that is it sort of makes me curious, and it piques my curiosity. And I found with your book, in both books really, actually going to online or Wikipedia or whatever to find out more about these characters. I told you that I knew about Stepin Fetchit, but I didn't know a lot about him, and I feel like I know a heck of a lot more about him now. After I read your book, I was just curious and wanted to know more, and I think that's a sign of a great novel that sort of makes me go deeper and dig around a little bit myself.
I think people like finding truth in fiction.
Right.
It's really satisfying. I do. I read fiction and then I'm like, okay, make a note. I'm going to look that up. Make a note. I want to know more. And I think that's full body brain contact. It's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. I'm ready to push the little button and just watch a video or something as we go. I thought it would be nice if you could, for our audience, that there might be a section of the book that you could read to give them an example for those that haven't read it.
Sure.
That provides a little taste of Songs of Willow Frost.
Yeah, you bet. I'd love to.
After this, we'll take questions too from the audience.
You bet. I'm just going to read, literally 2 pages, and I always read like never more than 2 pages, and and I do that because I have this deep personal theory / paranoia that because we were all read to at bedtime one of these days, I'm going to go 2 pages too long, and it's going to be like, don't want to do that to you. An interviewer recently asked me to sum up my career in 1 sentence.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Sum up if you were a karaoke song. I like when interviewers ask questions. It's like the dating game. You know, what kind of animal would you be if you were a writer? Yeah, I did. He asked me to sum up my career, and my first thought was, slow down. I only got 2 books. You know. Thank you, but yeah. But I did. My answer was, I basically get paid really well to break my own heart on a regular basis. And I think a lot of writers relate to that. And so I'm going to try to break your hearts just a little bit. But I always feel, I promise, it's my responsibility as an author. If I break your hearts, I promise to put the pieces back together in hopefully better working condition. This is the beginning of the book, Sacred Hearts, 1934. William Ing woke to the sound of a snapping leather belt and the shrieking of rusty springs that supported the threadbare mattress of his army surplus bed. He kept his eyes closed as he listened to the bare feet of children shuffling nervously on the cold wooden floor. He heard the popping and billowing of sheets being pulled back like trade winds filling a canvas sail, and so he drifted on the favoring currents of his imagination, as he always did, to someplace else, anywhere but the Sacred Heart Orphanage, where the sisters inspected the linens every morning and began whipping the bedwetters. He would have sat up if he could, stood at attention at the foot of his bunk like the others, but his hands were tied literally to the bed frame. I told you it would work, Sister Briganti said to a pair of orderlies whose dark skin looked even darker against their starched white uniforms. Sister Briganti's theory was that bedwetting was caused by boys illicitly touching themselves, and so at bedtime she began tying the boys' shoes to their wrists, and when that failed, she tied their wrists to their beds. It's a miracle, she said as she spoke and poked and prodded the dry sheets between William's legs. He watched as she crossed herself, then paused, sniffing her fingers as though seeking evidence her eyes and hands might not reveal. Amen, William thought as he realized his bedding was dry. He knew that like an orphan child, Sister Briganti had learned to expect the worst, and she was rarely, if ever, disappointed. After the boys were untied and the last offending child punished, William was finally allowed to wash before breakfast. He stared at the long row of identical toothbrushes and washcloths that hung from matching hooks. Last night there had been 40, but now one set was missing, and rumors immediately spread among the boys as to who the runaway might be. Tommy. William knew the answer as he scanned the washroom and didn't see another matching face. Tommy must have fled in the night. That makes me the only Chinese boy left at Sacred Heart. The sadness and isolation he might have felt was muted by a morning free from the belt, replaced by the hopeful smiles the other boys made as they washed their faces. "Happy birthday, Willie," a freckle-faced boy said as he passed by. Others sang or whistled the birthday song. It was September 28th, 1934, William's 12th birthday, everyone's birthday, in fact. Apparently it was much easier to keep track of that way. Armistice Day might have been more fitting, William thought, since some of the older kids at Sacred Heart had lost their fathers in the Great War, or October 29th, Black Tuesday, when the entire country had fallen on hard times. Since the crash, the number of orphans had tripled, but Sister Briganti had chosen the coronation of Venerable Pope Leo XII as everyone's new day of celebration, a collective birthday, which meant a trolley ride from Laurelhurst to downtown, where the boys would be giving buffalo nickels to spend at the candy butcher before being treated to a talking picture at the Moore Theater. But best of all, William thought, on our birthdays, and only on our birthdays, are we allowed to ask about our mothers. Thanks. Oh. Thanks.
Very nice. So we're going to take some questions now, and hopefully I'll be able to see you in the, oh, there you all are.
Wow.
And you'll see the microphones on both sides, and if you could please step to the microphone if you have a question so that we can hear your question as well. I'm looking for a hand. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, right here.
Hi, my name is Lisa, and two questions really. How long did it take you to write both books? And after completing so much research, how did you begin with all of that information? And I'm thinking that maybe you continued to do research as you kept writing.
With both books, was almost an identical process of about 6 months of fairly intensive research and then about 3 months of fairly intensive writing for that first draft. And so about a year for each book. And then, there's editing and other things that happen. Research-wise, I do a ton of research. I make copious notes. I gather stuff that just inhabits my office. And I have the thrust of the story in mind. I have a concept, a beginning and an ending, and I recreate the world as best I can. And I get to a point with the research where I'm just so afraid that I'm going to forget something or my mind's just going to burst if I don't write that I just start writing frantically. And with both books, I was about 80% of the way into the story where I stopped and did a little bit more research just to validate my assumptions, because one historical point of view will say this and another one will say that, and you have to take point A and point B and project to point C, and sometimes you have to make some sort of guess, and you want to do a little research or interview someone just to validate where you're going. That's a great question.
Next question. I'm right over here, and if you could tell us your name too, I forgot to mention that. Thank you for telling us your name.
I suppose there are a number of you here who are like I am. Haven't published a thing. But hope to someday. I've heard pros and cons about an agent. What is your feeling about that? Do we have to have one, or should we just go it alone, or what should we do?
I really think you need an agent, and it's not really up to me. It's the major publishers, all but Tor, who represents science fiction and fantasy. And Tor is great, but they don't. The other ones don't look at unagented manuscripts. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is one of those classic stories that was sent in the slush pile, and they pluck it out. And that business model really doesn't exist anymore. So they use this world of agents almost to vet the stories. But if you have a story that you just want to produce for posterity, and it can be your memoir, a novel, a book of poetry, whatever, there's nothing wrong with just printing it yourself, having it written. For some reason, if you enjoy the process of writing, or if you have something you want to share with other people, you can do that without the blessing of an agent or a publisher. But if you want to sell it to a wide audience, and you want to make a living at it, or at least make money at it, then you kind of need an agent.
Thank you.
Sure. I mean, and there are exceptions. There are self-published dynamos that end up blowing up big, but when they do, it's always after they sign with an agent and sign with a traditional publisher who has the distribution to actually get the book out there.
Yeah, those sort of self-publishing phenoms are actually sort of helping agents sort of figure out who they want to go get now. I mean, they have some success, and then those people usually move right on up to an agent, become an agented author.
Yeah, if they have a margin of success, agents will find them and say, hey, I could open these doors for you, and usually they do.
Yeah. Do we have other questions? Right down here. We'll bring a microphone to you, sir, if you need it. Oh, you sure do.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
You talked about, in your own reading, younger having phases.
Sure.
And you spent time with Orson Scott Card.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see yourself moving into other areas of fiction?
Like science fiction
or horse racing?
Sure, sure.
Whatever.
Sure. I mean, I read everything, and part of it is I'm in a book club, so that exposes me to lots of things.
A male book club. They're rare.
Yeah, I'm in a guy's book club
Yeah.
called Books and Brews. And so they do exist. And we read the books, and we drink the beers. But I really don't want to say no to anything. It's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of literary authors that suddenly they have kind of a magical realism, or they have a post-apocalyptic kind of tale in them. So I would never say never. But it's not on the forefront. I like history. The research part is really satisfying for me. I have a young adult book that I've slowly been collecting materials for, which would be historical, but also maybe a little bit fantastical, set in the late 1800s. And so the term for that is gas lamp fantasy. I didn't know there was even a term for it. There's a term called steampunk, and sort of which is for more technological based, but the fantasy, sort of a Sherlock Holmesian type fantasy story. They call it gas lamp fantasy. It's that era. So maybe, but I'm not sure.
Right back here. Let's wait till we get to a microphone, if we could. Coming right up. And if you could stand up, too, and let us know your name.
My name is Stephanie. You mentioned that you wrote Hotel to be true to people, places, and things. I'm just curious, have you ever been contacted by anyone that thinks they're in your book?
Oh, yes, well, sort of. I mention a character named Dr. Luke actually in both books, because there was a famous doctor that lived in Chinatown, and he's passed away. But I've had several of his relatives go, that was my great uncle, that's really great that you put him in there, and they tell me a little bit more of their story. As far as specifically the internment, I haven't had anyone say, that's my story, like that's me, but I've had people come up to me and say, when I have people come up to me and say, that was my experience. Thank you for writing this story. I've had people come up to me and say, I was Chinese in love with a Japanese girl, and we went separate ways. I've had lots of stories of long lost love. Most of them remained lost. Lots of moments that people connected with, where they came up and shared those moments. One story that came up was really nice to hear, I guess, even though the moment was tragic. In Hotel, it doesn't occur in the book, but it's mentioned in a side conversation that they're having, that there was another camp where a Japanese man was shot and killed. Some trucks were coming in, and he was basically standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the soldiers shot him. And the soldier that killed him was court-martialed, and his punishment was that he was fined the cost of one bullet. That was his punishment. And that gentleman who was killed, his niece had written me saying, thank you for putting that in there, that's my uncle. And I don't want people to forget that.
Do we have one more question? One more? Oh, up top.
Hi, I'm Luann. Living in the Pacific Northwest versus now living in Montana, those are two vastly different parts of the world, and I'm just curious as to whether you're mining Montana for some gold for your
some
next
stories?
stories.
Interesting question. Has anyone read Ivan Doig? Okay, yeah, Ivan. He's a wonderful writer. Ivan grew up where I live currently, approximately, and Ivan lives in Seattle. So he's written his 15th novel. He's lived in Seattle for 40 years and has written 15 novels set in Montana. And I live in Montana and write about Seattle. And I finally met him. I thought when we shook hands, we'd have this Freaky Friday, like head-swapping moment. My only explanation is I probably won't write about Montana because I live it every day. And I do think writers write about what they lament. They write about things they pine away for in some fashion. And for me, that's Seattle. And maybe the Seattle that doesn't exist anymore, but that's the Seattle I'm wedded to in my heart.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say thank you, Jamie Ford, Songs of Willow Frost, The Hotel in the Corner, very sweet. Thank you. Doing the National Writers Series.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really
That was
wonderful.
fun. That was great.